This video contains spoilers. Horrible and racist. The magic system in the book just felt like a rip-off of the Grishaverse. Another generic fantasy that appropriates Russian culture by twisting the tragic history of Anastasia Romanova. No thanks. This book is about slavery, a false oppression narrative that equates having legitimately dangerous magical powers that kill people with being an oppressed minority, like a person of colour. So I read this book. I want to start this video off with a disclaimer. As you can clearly tell, I'm white, so I'm not exactly the authority on what is and isn't racist. I will be trying to prevent the controversy in this video with as much nuance and balance as possible. However, I will likely have my biases, which is why I will have a Google Doc with my sources linked in the description in case you want to look into this further. Blood Heir by Amelie Wen Zhao is a loose retelling of the story of Anastasia Romanov. It's a very classic young adult fantasy full of the tropes one would expect from the genre. An overpowered and annoying female protagonist, a bad boy love interest with a heart of gold, and an overly simplistic view of morality. It's not exactly the next Game of Thrones, but it's not egregiously bad either. So why did it stir up so much controversy? Like most drama, everything started on Twitter. A user tweeted, quote, "I'll tell you which 2019 debut author, according to the Whisper Network, has been gathering screenshots of people who didn't like her book and giving off Kathleen Hale vibes. Amelie Wen Zhao." The original poster did not provide any evidence to support this claim and went private soon after, so we'll definitely be taking this with a grain of salt. However, this tweet started an absolute shitstorm. Two other authors, who I will not name to protect them from further harassment, tweeted, quote, "Explain to me how you write a book pretty much about slavery and oppression suffered by the black community, such as a system that uses not only slaves, but people arrested by the authoritative system in place to be used as relatively free labour, but oppression is blind to skin colour." And, "Dear POC writers, you are not immune to charges of racism just because you are POC. Racism is systemic, especially anti-blackness. And colourblindness is extremely tone-deaf. Learn from this and do better." I'm not entirely sure if these authors had actually read arcs of the book or not. Some sources say they had, but it appears that the first comment was a direct response to a synopsis of the book. Quote, "In a world where the princess is the monster, oppression is blind to skin colour, and good and evil exist in shades of grey." To be fair to this poster, this is a pretty bad synopsis. But to be fair to Zhao, this was probably written by her publisher, not her. These two call-out tweets, written by people who may or may not have read the book, started a huge dog pile on the author, with people who hadn't read the book flooding it with one-star reviews on Goodreads and harassing the author on her social media. Other accusations levelled at Zhao included plagiarism and use of offensive tropes. Eventually, this led to Zhao delaying publishing the book. She posted a statement, quote, "To the book community. I want to start by saying that I have the utmost respect for your voices, and I am listening. I'm grateful to those who have raised questions around representation, coding, and themes in my book. I emigrated from China when I was 18. Drawing on my own multicultural upbringing and the complex history of my heritage that has incidences of bias and oppression, I wrote Blood Heir from my immediate cultural perspective. The issues around Affinite indenturement in the story represent a specific critique of the epidemic of indentured labour and human trafficking prevalent in many industries across Asia, including in my own home country. The narrative and history of slavery in the United States is not something I can, would, or intended to write, but I recognise that I am not writing in merely my own cultural context. I am so sorry for the pain this has caused. It was never my intention to bring harm to any reader of this valued community, particularly those for whom I seek to write and empower. As such, I have decided to ask my publisher not to publish Blood Heir at this time, and they have agreed. I don't wish to clarify, defend, or have anyone defend me. This is not that. This is an apology. With the feedback of the community, I feel this is the right decision. Thank you. Sincerely, Amelie." So, naturally, a bunch of people rushed to defend her. Headlines came out about a debut author being the victim of a hate campaign, about cancel culture, about how her career was ruined by a Twitter mob. But it's not that simple. Let's dig a little deeper into the critiques made by the book community. There's one critique of this novel that we can immediately dismiss: plagiarism. Some people noticed that certain scenes and quotes from the book were very similar to those in other books, like Lord of the Rings and The Hunger Games. The magic system and world building is also very similar to that in the Gritterverse books by Leigh Bardugo. To that, I say, yes, these similarities exist. But that doesn't make it plagiarism. Yes, Blood Heir is not an entirely original work, as it draws on many different influences. But it tells its own story with the use of these influences. Claim dismissed. Next, other critiques are a bit more complicated. As we discuss them, I want to make it very clear that I have only read the final published version of the book, whereas many of these critiques came from those who had read ARCs. So it is possible that these issues were much worse in the original version and had been fixed in the version I read. The first of these critiques is that Blood Heir uses the trope of a black girl dying to motivate the white girl protagonist. You may remember this trope from The Hunger Games. So in Blood Heir, our main character Anna is best friends with this young girl called May, but then May dies protecting Anna. I had a lot of issues with this part of the book anyway, as I will discuss later, because it felt like an obvious and lazy attempt by the author to make me feel sad. However, apparently, in the original version of the story, May was black. In the version I read, she was described as having darker skin, but not explicitly black. Also, Anna is not white in this world, she is mixed race. But I do feel like the ARC reviewers were totally valid in calling out the use of this problematic trope. I think the biggest part of this controversy was people taking issue with the way Zhao depicted slavery in Blood Heir. This is where things will get very complicated for me to try and explain. So I'll give you a really quick overview of the world of Blood Heir. In this fantasy world, some people have elemental magic, and some don't. In the country where most of the story is set, those who have magic are persecuted, trafficked, and enslaved by those without. Many readers, especially Americans, interpreted this as an allegory for the American slave trade, and found it to be a very offensive depiction of this. However, Zhao actually never intended for this book to be about American slavery. In an interview with NPR, Zhao states, "These are forms of modern slavery that continue to impact 20 to 40 million victims around the world in countries such as North Korea, India, Thailand, Russia, Eastern Europe." And the main character, Anna, she is one of these vulnerable populations, and she's in danger of being trafficked and exploited. And that's what she fights against in the book. Gosh, I need to move, my back's already getting sore. There are two perspectives I've seen on this discussed online. The first is one that I honestly probably fall more into, which is that not everything is about America. As someone who is not American, I do get a little annoyed with Americans being confused or even offended about things that aren't America-centric. For example, on TikTok recently, a lot of Americans, who are way too old for this shit, are just now learning that some countries have Christmas in the summertime. That's funny. Meanwhile, people from outside America are constantly bombarded with American media to the point where we know almost as much about America as actual Americans. What Zhao sought to interrogate and critique was the modern-day epidemic of human trafficking and endured labour, as it wasn't something she had seen in YA literature. She shouldn't have to include reference to the American slave trade in a book that was never supposed to be about that. It's not offensive, and frankly, it's offensive for people to demand that a Chinese immigrant write from an American point of view. Zhao has said that the controversy was particularly devastating because it felt to me like my perspective wasn't welcome in this country. However, the other perspective is still important to consider, which is that just because an author didn't intend to write something offensive about a group of people doesn't mean that their work can't be offensive towards those groups. So just because Zhao didn't intend to write a book about the American slave trade doesn't mean that the content in her book wasn't somewhat offensive towards Black Americans. Let's go back to the example of May's death. Even though May is not explicitly described as black, many readers interpreted her description that way. This meant that the trope of her dying to save Anna was interpreted as racist and anti-black, even when the author did not intend for that. Some critics even go further and state that writing a book with slavery as a theme and not addressing the American history of slavery is disingenuous. And finally, people just have issues with the trope of using the oppression of people with magic or superpowers as an allegory for oppression in real life. This is a very common trope, and one you are likely already familiar with. It's used in the Grishaverse, X-Men, Dragon Age, Attack on Titan, etc. The problem with this trope is that the Aphanites in Blood Heir, or the mutants in X-Men, have extremely dangerous powers that can be used to hurt people, so their oppression can be justified as self-preservation. Whereas in real life, people of colour, queer people, or other minority groups are not a threat to the lives of white, straight people. But media with this trope seems to imply that they are. Bad optics. However, as a queer person myself, I don't actually mind the use of this trope most of the time. In fact, I'm a big fan of most of the media I just listed that includes it. That's because, 1, a lot of the time it's implied that these people are only dangerous because the oppression they face makes them angry, and 2, all these pieces of media have strong anti-oppression narratives. Even if the oppression that people with these kinds of powers face could be justified, the narrative makes it very clear that oppression of any kind, towards anyone, is never justified. I think that this message is really powerful, but I totally understand why some people don't like this trope. It's complicated. Overall, I would say that this whole controversy is actually a rare example of productive Twitter discourse. Zhao sent out arcs of her book to readers. Those readers responded with feedback. Zhao then took the time to address the problems they identified before publishing the final edition of the book. The only real issue is that so many people who hadn't read arcs of the book decided to get involved, and the whole situation was massively blown out of proportion. The book was eventually published, the next 2 books in the trilogy were published, and no one died. At the end of all this, we just have one question left. Is the book even good? So this book is about our girl Anna, who is the princess of the Kingdom of Cyrelia. This is a kingdom where some people have elemental magic, and those people are imprisoned or enslaved by those without magic. Unfortunately for Anna, she not only has this elemental magic, but her affinity is for blood. After having a very traumatic childhood, Anna is framed for her father, the Emperor's death, and has to fake her death. Now, she is out for revenge. The story starts very abruptly, which I found quite jarring. Anna is visiting a prison to meet with an infamous conman who she thinks will be able to help her find her father's killer. His name? Ramson Quicktongue. Ramson tries to use Anna to break out of prison, but she goes full rage mode on him with her affinity and forces him into an alliance with her. And so that is how we start out our enemies to lovers romance, which honestly carried the entire series for me when the plot completely fell off in the second book. I really was not a fan of this book at first. The beginning kind of felt like walking in during the second act and having no clue what was going on. We're thrown into this prison break action scene where our main characters are slaughtering people left and right, and we don't even know who or where they are. Then we spend the rest of the novel piecing together how these characters ended up where they were at the start of the book. We also meet May soon after, and as discussed earlier, she serves as a sort of sacrificial lamb for the story. May was a young slave girl who befriended Anna and ran away with her. She dies pretty early on in the story. Her death feels like it's intended to make you cry, but it just made me roll my eyes. May didn't feel like a person to me, or even a character really. She just felt like a tool to make us understand Anna better. Anna has a real soft spot for young girls, which comes up constantly in the series. May is supposed to represent everything that's good in the world that Anna is fighting for, or something like that. Even if May isn't black and this isn't an offensive aspect of the book, I think it's still pretty rubbish, to be honest. Sorry, Amelie. The book really starts to pick up, however, thanks to us learning more about our boy Ramson. Normally, I am really not a fan of the bad boy with a heart of gold trope, but for some reason, Ramson really does it for me. Maybe it's because he's such a simp. He starts out planning on betraying Anna once he has what he needs from her, but soon he falls for her. Hard. Also, his tragic backstory that taught him not to love anyone centers around his best bro dying, rather than his mother, sister, ex-girlfriend, or any of the usual crap. So I'm actually kinda super into him. But anyway. Another thing I liked about this book was the world. It is very similar to the Grishaverse in terms of having a bunch of different kingdoms and cultures, all with very Russian-inspired names and aesthetics. The pacing in this book was wild. I mentioned that it started very abruptly, kind of in the middle of the actual story. Well, the pacing doesn't get better from there. The story seemed to reach its emotional climax in a normal fashion, with Ramson and Anna travelling around a bit, meeting other characters, and getting into fights, before finally reaching Novominsk, the city where Ramson plans on confronting his former employer, and Anna plans on confronting her father's killer. Everything goes wrong, and the two of them get captured. This was where I was expecting the book to end, and the next book would start with them escaping and finding each other again. But no, because there's still a third of the book left. After the characters are captured, they're both conveniently freed by other characters, and Anna finds out that her adopted auntie is behind her father's death and her being framed for it. Anna ends up teaming up with another girl called Lynn, who ends up becoming the third POV character within the last few chapters of the book, and they head to the capital to stop her auntie. Somehow, Ramson ends up there as well, but their plans to stop the evil auntie fail, and she ends up killing Anna's brother and becoming empress, while Anna has to fake her death again to escape the palace. So when you really think about it, she ends this book in the exact same place she started it, only things have gotten worse. This last third of the book drags on so much, and yet at the same time, so many aspects of it are rushed, like the introduction of a new main character and the villain reveal. The story ended up having two big climax moments, which was really strange. Despite my qualms with the pacing and story structure, I would give this book 4 out of 5 stars. But that's rounded up from a 3.5. Is this a unique and original story? No. Is it high quality? No. Is it life-changing literature? No. God, I mean. But not all books have to be like that. Blood Heir was fun. It was tropey. It was comforting in a way. I liked the fact that I could kind of predict what would happen next. All the characters and the story beats felt familiar. I never felt worried about any of them because I knew that if they ended up somewhere bad, they would get saved. And that's exactly what happened. This book reminded me of why I love YA fantasy. I'm so glad this book ended up being published. It's not going to change the world, and it's not mine or probably anyone's favourite book. But it's clear that Amelie Wenjiao was really passionate about this, so I'm happy for her. I think it would have really sucked if she'd been unable to publish her debut novel due to online backlash, especially when most of her critics hadn't even read the book.
I am an immigrant. I am a woman of colour. And I am an other. In my time in the United States, I have never experienced the sense of crushing fear about my identity that I have recently. Get out of my country, communist, is only one of the slurs I've had screamed at me from across the street. What I've experienced personally and seen across social media outlets and national television broadcasts has all amounted to a hyper-awareness of my foreignness, my otherness, and the possibility that because I am different, I am not worthy of belonging.
So, those were my thoughts on the controversy and the book itself. Please do not send any hate towards the real people involved in this. It all happened a while ago, so they're just trying to get on with their lives. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like it. I'm currently reading the sequel to Blood Heir, Red Tigress, so if this video does well enough, I'll probably make a part 2 reviewing the rest of the trilogy. Also, please subscribe. I'm a brand new channel just getting started, so it would be really appreciated. Bye bye! Oh.